John Wick is dying, and I'm not talking about the character. I mean the story. What started out as a breath of fresh air in the action genre has become a bad excuse for well-choreographed, gratuitous violence. There was a time when John Wick represented everything great about action cinema. It had a compelling lead, a simple story anyone could get behind, a world teeming with potential and intrigue, and fight scenes that were far better than they had any right to be. The time I'm referring to is, of course, when humanity was blessed with Keanu Reeves' performance in John Wick 2014. But that time of compelling stories and potential-filled world-building is over. The year is 2019, and we have just been graced with the third installment of the John Wick franchise, Chapter 3, Parabellum, which was easily the most divisive of the trilogy and left the most room for conclusive criticism. Whereas the first film presented to us a vulnerable, enigmatic ex-hitman who just wanted to settle a score, Parabellum leaves us with John being so jaded and desperate that he literally drains the world around him of its mystique. What do I even mean? I mean that John Wick as an action movie franchise is decaying. It is losing the quality that earned it the audience's investment in the first place and is hanging on by a thread. That thread arguably being the scope and caliber of the action scenes and Keanu Reeves' real-world charisma. John Wick needs your help. And without further ado, here's why.
I am old.
John Wick was a flash-in-the-pan moment for action cinema. It, along with the release of Kingsman the same year, was widely thought to be the start of the modern action renaissance, bringing the focus back to wide-angled, well-choreographed, smooth, distinct action, moving away from the Taken and Bourne-styled frantic, messy, shaky-cam action which left the burden of clarity up to the editors. John Wick came out of nowhere as an inventive twist on the revenge film genre. I think what's most surprising of all is that it blew us all away despite being such a simple movie with a rather two-dimensional main character. Imagine pitching this movie to investors. Some Russian mafia punks kill an ex-hitman's dog and steal his car, and so he kills all of them. We've seen that movie a dozen times before. There's nothing inherently unique about John Wick's plot, but it still manages to captivate us all the way through. And for the most part, it does so by giving us just a taste of a bustling criminal underworld where assassins congregate in dedicated facilities, live and die by a code of ethics, and how John Wick fits into it. The film only gives us hints and clues as to the bigger picture, and that adds so much charm to what would otherwise be a typical action movie, aside from the fight scenes. Speaking of which, John Wick's fight scenes are nothing short of spectacular. The action choreography is just another way in which this movie took a massive risk with admirable results. Keanu Reeves trained for months leading up to principal shooting. By the time the camera started rolling, he was proficient in tactical shooting, offensive driving, and numerous martial arts. The creative combination of gunplay and hand-to-hand combat led to the re-emergence of the term gun fu, which was most prominently showcased in Equilibrium beforehand. I have no idea what exactly went into John Wick's amazing action scenes, but I know that the effort was well worth it considering the finished product. The movement is clear, the geography is clear, the hits and gunshots are clear, and most importantly, our main character's motivation is clear.
Stole that from me. Killed that from me!
For those of you out there who contend that shaky cam fights can still be well choreographed and of a high caliber, I wouldn't disagree. The climactic fight scene in The Bourne Ultimatum is an excellent example of shaky cam used well. The stakes are real and the situation is urgent. The fast, erratic nature of the editing adds to the atmosphere of the fight. But even then, putting the burden of action clarity on the choreographers and director is vastly preferable to letting the fight scene get made in post. After all, if your fight scene is poorly directed, choreographed, and edited, you increase the risk of sacrificing clarity, arguably one of the most important factors in action. A wise man once said,
"This will always look better than this."
It probably comes as no surprise to you that my gold standard for action is the Raid series. Having seen that cinematic yet gratuitous violence was not only possible for action movies, but viable as a vehicle for the story, warmed my heart to no end. Upon seeing the hallway fight scene from the Raid Redemption, I was hooked on this style of zoomed out, expertly rehearsed cinematic combat, and I was pleasantly surprised to see it in John Wick. As far as I'm concerned, and I will die on this hill, John Wick is the best action movie of all time. Straightforward story, compelling motivations, alluring world building, and incredible action. It ticks all the boxes an action movie can: good villains, intimidating henchmen, hand-to-hand fighting, guns, cars, and a main character we can all get behind. I don't think anyone expected an action indie film directed by a stuntman about an out-of-retirement assassin to have as much of a cultural impact as John Wick did, but it defied expectations in yet another regard. It left its mark on all facets of pop culture and facilitated the return of expertly coordinated, clear action in mainstream cinema. Such a milestone in action movie history is undeniably inevitably a hard act to follow. John Wick set the standard with regards to action, writing, and direction, and Chapter 2 followed suit, introducing new mechanics of the criminal underworld, giving John a challenge beyond personal revenge, and dialing the action up to 11. Chapter 2 begins approximately 4 days after John offed Vigo and got himself a replacement dog and sees the titular character endeavoring to retrieve his car, the theft of which was one of the inciting incidents for this whole saga. The movie leads with an almost word-for-word repeat of the dialogue from the first movie's sledgehammer scene, this time intercut with footage of John stealth killing Vigo's brother's henchman. Most notable in this scene is that John's first order of business after getting his car back is to use it as a weapon against the enemies and vehicles around him, thereby trashing it. Thankfully, the movie has the self-awareness to acknowledge this apparent disconnect between John's thoughts and actions, but it isn't at all developed. John just seems unfazed for the rest of the movie without his beloved car. For the sake of charity, I will admit that this contradiction is a nitpick. It has no serious impact on the plot and can even be justified by how stoic we know John to be. Just as John is settling back into his life now that he's gotten his revenge, his car is essentially back in his possession, and he has a new companion, he gets presented by this movie's main conflict. It is revealed to the audience that because Santino D'Antonio aided John in his impossible task, the event that facilitated John's escape from the underworld, John is in debt to him. This debt is represented in the form of a marker, a disc that houses the bloody fingerprint of the debtor, and a space for the fingerprint of the bearer. This scene only serves to build on the pre-established lore of this world. It takes what we know about the shadow organization of assassins and develops it. Just as soon after, when John sees Winston about his predicament, Winston reveals that honoring a marker is another one of the underworld's rules. During the meeting, Winston says,
"Two rules that cannot be broken, Jonathan. No blood on continental grounds, and every marker must be honored."
This is very interesting. The first movie only established one rule: no business may be conducted on continental grounds. But apparently there are multiple rules. Winston's wording here is strangely precise. Saying that there are two rules that cannot be broken indirectly implies that there are rules that can be broken, but then we'd be living with the animals. This is odd. In a world as bizarre and creative as John Wick's, you'd think they'd have more than two rules, but at the same time, maybe those are the only rules they need. In any case, saying that there are two rules that cannot be broken kinda gets in the way if you want to introduce new rules in later movies.
You dishonor the mark, you die. You kill the holder of the mark, you die. You run, you die.
Okay, cool. Now we're clear on the parameters of the honor the marker rule. Thank you, Winston.
While my judgment comes in the form of excommunicado, a high table. Demand a more severe outcome if their traditions are refused.
Back to the plot. John agrees to pay his debt, even though he's not happy about it, travels to Rome, thus introducing us to the first continental hotel outside of New York, and kills his target. Santino's goons show up to tie up loose ends, but John kills all of them with guns he hid in the catacombs in anticipation of this very event, again showing us John's capacity for strategy. He returns to New York only for hitmen everywhere to try to kill him in order to claim the bounty Santino put on his head. He seeks help from the Bowery King, yet another fine addition to this world's lore, and goes about pursuing Santino. After killing all his goons, again, John meets Santino in the Continental and promptly spills blood on hotel grounds right in front of the manager. This moment had me truly worried for John. Had he just sacrificed his own life just to get even? Had John Wick just forfeited his life and forsaken his dog purely so that he could get some petty revenge? It seems like it, but then the movie hit me with this.
You leave me no choice but to declare you excommunicado.
Okay, John's alive for the time being. Great. I mean, they did set this up earlier, and although John is now a rogue agent and the whole planet is out to collect the bounty on his head, at least the story is logically consistent. But wait, this is a massive plot contradiction. In John Wick Chapter 2, Winston explicitly states that his judgment comes in the form of excommunicado, which is the setup for what happens at the end of the movie. But we have an example of Winston blatantly defying that sentiment. In John Wick, after Perkins kills someone in the New York Continental, she is confronted by Winston in person and murdered as retribution for her breach of conduct. In both instances, the guilty party's membership to the Continental gets revoked, but while Perkins is murdered, John gets the assassin equivalent of a slap on the wrist. Yes, every hitman out there wants him for the bounty, but Winston had nothing to do with that. Winston killed someone for breaking the rules in one case and excommunicated them in another, thereby nullifying his own principle. I haven't watched the first two movies in a while, so maybe someone on the internet can give me a sensible explanation as to this apparent contradiction. No, I guess they can't. For all the attention to detail the people behind the scenes pay to these movies, I find it unsettling that they missed this. Maybe Winston had a change of heart between movies that we weren't made aware of, but at the end of the day, if it's not in the movie, I don't care. Chapter 2 develops the narrative elements that the first movie established. It introduced the Italian Continental and the Bowery. John actually interacted with members of the High Table. We got a deeper look into the world with the marker, and the scale of the action in Chapter 2 undoubtedly topped the first's. But while Chapter 2 went bigger, it did not get better, which I'll elaborate on later. John Wick laid the foundation for this world, and Chapter 2 built upon it, while failing to pass the structural integrity test. The most recent entry in the John Wick saga was Chapter 3, Parabellum. Firstly, allow me to get my praise of the movie out of the way to make room for the juicy stuff. Remember how I said that Chapter 2 dialed the action up to 11? I lied, because Parabellum retroactively pushes Chapter 2 down to a 10 at most. The knife shop fight scene is arguably the most iconic fight in the whole series so far, and that was just the beginning. Ernest, the stables, the dogs, the bikes, armor improvements, and the knife shop could all stand as action short films on their own merits, but they're all in one movie together. These aren't just formalities being ticked off a box, in fact it seems like they centered the plot around these fight scenes. That might have been to the movie's detriment, but these scenes took so much love and care to construct and execute that it's amazing this movie had any room left for story. Parabellum is an action fan's dream. A character you know and love, development of their world, and large-scale cinematic action that isn't totally brain-dead. Owed to the sheer scope of action in Parabellum, I'd argue that it's better than Chapter 2, although more contrivance-filled. So let's get to the brunt of my criticism. The John Wick franchise is in decline. It started with Chapter 2, but Parabellum has reinforced this notion. As a result of Chapter 2 building on the first movie as much as it did, it does not stand on its own as a film. It suffers from sequelitis while also hurting the pre-established in-world mechanics. Parabellum suffers a similar ailment, but with this entry the story and characters have taken a hit along with the world building. Parabellum starts almost immediately where Chapter 2 left off, with John and his dog running while the clock ticks down to the time when John will officially be excommunicado. His first order of business is to send his dog back to Sharon, whose company he just left the previous night, and then he goes off to the library to retrieve a marker, a rosary, some coins, and a photo of him and Helen. Here we have yet another stash of resources John hid away who knows how long ago, only now being used to meet very specific plot requirements. At this point it's getting old, but this is a nitpick. After playing with some of his friends, John makes his way to a theater and asks an old lady for passage to Morocco. In this scene alone we learn John Wick's real name, how he learned to fight, where his tattoos come from, and that the rosary is essentially a ticket that can take the holder anywhere. They don't make it clear what it does, but my point is that for a story that was so compelling and intriguing because of the mystery surrounding the criminal underworld, explaining and revealing information in this manner only serves to detract from its charm. To be fair, they could have done it worse. At least this scene doesn't feel contrived, as we knew that John must have gotten his start somewhere, and he ostensibly couldn't use any other means to get to Morocco. I think the problem lies with the fact that part of what made John Wick great was the mystery, so by revealing aspects of his past it feels like derogating his character. The biggest problem I have with this scene is the rosary, the ticket that gets torn in order to get John from New York to Morocco. Think about this from a technical writing standpoint. The rosary is an object given to an individual in order to be traded in at a later time for a favor. Sound familiar? Why not just have graduates of this assassin school get given markers instead? If there is an inalienable difference between a marker and a rosary, then the movie should make that clear, especially considering how similar they are in function. These two mechanics are so similar that I'm worried for the future of this franchise. What I initially thought was a world teeming with endless possibilities for assassin rules, rituals, and stories is beginning to seem rather repetitive. The action is extremely inventive and entertaining, I'll give the movie that, but I'm talking about the narrative elements. The world building is becoming less constructive and more routine. This should not happen in a world full of interesting and unique hitmen who operate under a shared code of conduct but are beholden to fantastical and frankly archaic traditions. The High Table is basically a shadow government that regulates what goes on in a criminal underworld. If that sounds like a boring concept to you, then I'm afraid you have no imagination, which is kind of my problem with the writers of John Wick. The first film was the perfect action movie, and the sequels have been bigger yet more poorly written action movies. Where's the diversity of genre? The furthest I'm willing to go is calling John Wick a fantasy, because in many regards it is. But these are still repetitive action movies with a fantastical twist. With the High Table being an integral part of John Wick's world, why haven't we gotten a conspiracy thriller or psychological horror? These are possibilities considering your entire life can be ruined just by failing to abide by rules instituted by a panel of malevolent underworld overlords. I mean, I don't know for sure if they're evil, but how virtuous can they be considering their occupations? John Wick can still primarily be an action franchise, but if the writers keep on missing opportunities to use this world to its full potential, then these movies won't reach the heights of storytelling success for which John Wick paved the way. When John meets Sophia, we learn that the reason she's in debt to him is that he helped exfiltrate her daughter and leave her somewhere safe, I guess. Again, they don't make it perfectly clear, but as far as I'm concerned, the more mystery the better. Sophia and John learn how John can find counsel with the one above the table, and upon meeting this enigmatic authority figure, John repledges his fealty to the high table and parts with a finger. And this is where the picture started looking grim for me. First off, the one who sits above the table is a stupid contrivance. The high table was well established as the highest authority in the underworld, but because John irreparably damaged his relations with it, the writers invented a character who inexplicably has more power than this world's governing body. They wrote themselves into a corner in Chapter 2, and this is how they got out of it. Yet again, this world proves to be more monotonous than we were led to believe. Secondly, the entire point of John getting the rosary, getting passage to Morocco, invoking his and Sophia's marker, seeing the coin minting guy, and trekking desert till he was almost dead was so that he could talk to this man. And what is his reason for living at this point?
To remember her. To remember us.
What even is this character anymore? This whole sentiment about wanting a chance to earn the ability to live for the memory of love spits in the face of the stoic pragmatist we've come to know. I understand that Helen was John's escape from the assassin life. I acknowledge that the whole reason John started off on his path of revenge was because the last remnant of his wife's love was ripped from him. Everything about John's emotional drive in the first movie was clear and justified, but look at what's happened since then. John willingly denied Santino's request, leading to his house getting destroyed. John honored his marker, but then had to fight his way through hordes of hitmen interested in claiming the bounty on his head. When John finally reaches Santino, the author of the contract, he kills him. Considering what Winston told him earlier in the same movie, John made this decision knowing that he would be excommunicated for it, meaning that continental services would be off limits to him. And considering that he just killed the author of the contract, it's not going away anytime soon. And considering that the author of the contract was a newly appointed member of the High Table, John has put himself at odds with the biggest guns in this world. The contract got doubled, went international, and John was excommunicated. He brought that on himself. Where is the foresight we know John has? Where is the practical planning ahead he exhibited in that same movie? Parabellum only makes the situation worse, as now that he's neck deep in the shit, he accesses another hidden stash of resources relevant to his particular circumstances at that moment in the story, uses up 2 of his favors, meets the one who sits above the table, and repledges his fealty. The deal here is that John will be allowed to live, in order to remember his wife, so long as he serves the table as an assassin. But in order to call off the contract and solidify his new role, he must kill Winston for his conduct. Winston's conduct being the reason John is alive at all. What is even happening right now? So John returns to New York, fights his way through interested parties, and upon confronting Winston, they agree to go to war with the High Table because at least they have each other. And when the dust settles, Winston tries to kill John. I have no idea where Chapter 4 will go with this development, so I'm going to leave any discussion regarding Winston's actions for another time, because John's behavior deserves all the attention. After he had settled back down with a new dog and his house intact, John denied a marker, killed a member of the High Table, repledged his loyalty to the High Table, and then broke that oath because Winston convinced him to. This man is living moment to moment with no concern for long-term consequences. What authority can John turn to now that he's betrayed the character this movie invented to solve the last movie's problem? How has John Wick survived this long in this dangerous world with such a lack of foresight? Oh wait, I know, it's because they introduced this empty-mindedness in Chapter 2 as a means for starting the plot and they just ran with it. Parabellum gets worse the more I think about it. Instead of growing the characters and narrative elements, it drains them of their mystique and drifts from plot point to plot point so that we can get more action set pieces. I'm perfectly comfortable watching John Wick for the action alone, but the satisfaction I get from the movies won't stop me from acknowledging their shortcomings. Parabellum falls short in quite a few more regards, but to make a long story short, the coin minting guy is a weak character. It's strange that in a world full of assassins, the adjudicator doesn't get her hands dirty herself, and despite explicitly saying that the Bowery King is to receive 7 cuts, there are only 6 audible slashes. Maybe they'll retcon this error to be the reason he's still alive or something stupid like that. At this point I wouldn't put it past them. This franchise is dying. Not financially, I mean it's making more money with every entry, so surely the fan base is growing, and the action is getting bigger and better every time. Okay, let me rephrase that. This story is dying. With every edition, the John Wick saga becomes more convoluted, contrived, and recurrent. In Parabellum, we see John at his most desperate, living from one minute to the next, all so that he can have a chance to remember his wife. and look where his choices got him. At this point, why not just join your wife in the afterlife? You got your revenge on Losef, got your revenge on Santino at the expense of your membership, burned every bridge leading to a restoration of agency, and now you've got nothing to live for. Give up your dog to someone who will actually be attentive to and responsible for it, and go be with your wife. Why live from one death-defying situation to the next purely so that you can reminisce about the good old days now, when you willingly forfeited your agency by killing a member of the High Table while there was an active bounty on you barely a day ago? Parabellum is full of flaws, but let's remember that the only reason John is even alive for it is because he had so much plot armor in Chapter 2 that Winston literally changed his policy on rule breakers so that this franchise could have a third installment. John Wick sequels are fundamentally broken. The main character no longer possesses the gravitas and mystery that made him so thrilling in the first place, and the once potential-filled world has turned out to be a humdrum backdrop for expertly choreographed gratuitous action. Thankfully, we still have the original. So far, nothing has been introduced that would retroactively make the first movie worse, but they aren't done making movies yet. Whatever comes next, I'd hope that it in some way re-establishes John's supremacy over the forces around him and grows the world in an organic way as opposed to just rehashing narrative elements we've already seen. John Wick is arguably the best action movie of all time, and one of the reasons for that is how it balances action, world building, and consistent writing. The sequels pale in comparison because they put too much focus on spectacle, thus marginalizing the storytelling. John Wick needs your help. Chapter 4 is most likely in pre-production right now, meaning that it's not too late to have our voices heard. If we all band together and ask nicely for character motivations and world building to get their share of screen time, Chapter 4 might just give us a story to rival that of the first movie. Regardless, I will go see whatever they make next because as a fan of action, I cannot help but adore what Chad Stahelski and the whole John Wick cast and crew have done for action cinema. As always, I love discussion and debate, so if you have any criticism of my take on the decline of the John Wick film series, let me know in the comments. Thanks for watching, see you next time.